My name is Viktor Petrov, and I've spent the better part of my life as a forest ranger, patrolling the barren, ghostly remnants of Chernobyl. You might think that after years of wandering through these desolate ruins, a person would grow numb to the decay, to the silence that presses in from all sides like a suffocating blanket. But let me tell you, Chernobyl is not a place where one can ever truly feel at ease. There's something here, something that never left when the people did, and I've felt its presence every single day. The air itself is heavy with memories of a life that was abruptly and violently snatched away. As I walk these cracked, overgrown streets, it's like the very ground beneath my feet is trying to whisper to me, telling me stories of what happened, of who was left behind. It's not the kind of silence you find in nature. It's more oppressive, more unnatural. The wind doesn't rustle the leaves because the trees themselves seem too frightened to move, too scared to disturb whatever it is that lingers here. I've always been a solitary man, finding comfort in the solitude of nature, but here, solitude feels different. It's like the emptiness is watching you, judging you, waiting for you to let your guard down. There are days when I swear I can feel eyes on me, but whenever I turn around, there's nothing. Just the same dead trees and crumbling buildings. Yet, that feeling of being watched, it never goes away. It's there, lurking, just out of reach, as if the ghosts of this place are too timid to show themselves, but too angry to leave me be. The strangest part of all is how Chernobyl changes when the sun goes down. During the day, it's eerie enough, but at night, the atmosphere thickens, as if the shadows themselves are reaching out to pull you into the darkness. I remember the first time I stayed out after dusk, thinking it was all in my head, just nerves from being alone in such a haunted place. But as the night dragged on, I started hearing things soft, almost imperceptible noises, like whispers carried on the wind, or footsteps that weren't my own. I can't say when exactly I started noticing these things, but once I did, there was no turning back. It was like a door had been opened, and something on the other side was curious about me, curious enough to start creeping closer, bit by bit. I'd always laughed at ghost stories, never one to believe in the supernatural, but what I've felt here, in this forsaken place, has made me question everything. It's hard to keep telling yourself that it's all in your head when the signs keep piling up, one after the other. I've tried to ignore it, to focus on my work, but the more I walk these grounds, the more I feel that something is trying to get my attention. There's a weight in the air that I can't shake, a heaviness that presses down on me, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. And yet, it's not just fear, it's more like a deep, gnawing dread, the kind that roots itself in your gut and refuses to let go. I've been here long enough to know that this place has secrets, and whatever they are, they're not the kind that let you sleep easy at night. So here I am, patrolling the same paths I've walked 1,000 times before, but now with a growing sense of unease. There's a reason why so few people come here, why even the bravest souls tend to stay away. It's not just the radiation or the decay, it's the feeling that something is always just out of sight, waiting, watching, and maybe even hoping for the chance to make itself known. But whatever it is, I have a feeling that the longer I stay, the closer it's going to get until there's no turning back. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the mind playing tricks, the product of too many years spent alone in a place that no living soul should linger. But you can only tell yourself that so many times before the doubts start to creep in. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, like a shadow slipping out of sight before I could catch a glimpse of it. I'd whip my head around, expecting to see someone, but there was never anything there. Just the emptiness staring back at me. But it kept happening, more often and more vividly. I'd be walking along, my thoughts somewhere else, when suddenly I'd feel that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I'd turn, and there it would be again, a movement, a blur, always at the very edge of my vision. I'd blink, and it would be gone. Every time, it left me with this cold, sinking feeling in my stomach, like I just missed something important, something that shouldn't be ignored. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the wind rustling through the debris, or maybe an animal scurrying away at the sound of my footsteps. But deep down, I knew better. The animals here are few and far between, and they don't stick around long enough to cause such unease. No, this was something different, something that felt almost sentient. Like it knew I was there, and was choosing to stay just out of reach, as if toying with me. The more it happened, the harder it became to shake off. I started noticing patterns, certain places where the movements were more frequent, more pronounced. The abandoned school, the old amusement park, the crumbling apartment blocks. It was like these places held a deeper connection to whatever was lurking in the shadows, like they were focal points for something much darker. I found myself avoiding them whenever I could, but the more I avoided, the stronger the pull became, like whatever it was there wanted me to come closer, to see it. Sleep became difficult. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those fleeting shapes, those almost figures that danced just out of sight. And then the dreams started, nightmares, really. I'd dream of walking through the ruins, just as I did every day, but in the dreams, I wasn't alone. There were others there, following me, watching me. They never got close enough for me to see their faces, but I could feel their presence, cold and malevolent, pressing in on me from all sides. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and the feeling of being watched would linger long after the dream had faded. I began to dread my patrols, the once familiar paths now feeling more like traps. Every corner, every doorway, held the potential for another glimpse, another reminder that something was out there, watching. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent it became. It was like a game, but one where I didn't know the rules, and every move I made seemed to draw me deeper into whatever was happening. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, if the years of isolation had finally caught up with me. But the fear I felt was too real, too immediate to be dismissed as just paranoia. And then, one day, as I was walking past the old hospital, I saw it. Not just a flicker this time, but a full, unmistakable shape. It was there, just for a second, standing in the doorway, its form twisted and wrong, like a person, but not quite. My breath caught in my throat, my heart stopped, and in that brief moment, I knew whatever this was, it wasn't just my imagination. It was real, and it was getting closer. I still remember the day I came face to face with them, those twisted, nightmarish figures that seemed to step right out of my darkest fears. It was an overcast afternoon, the kind where the sky is a dull, oppressive gray, and everything feels heavier, more suffocating. I was making my rounds near the ruins of Pripyat, a place that had always given me an uneasy feeling, like the very ground was cursed. But I'd never seen anything like this before. nothing that could have prepared me for what was about to happen. As I walked through the abandoned buildings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air was thick, almost choking, and the silence was so absolute that even my footsteps seemed to disappear into the void. That's when I saw them, at first just shadows, lurking in the corners of my vision, but as I got closer, they began to take form. It was like watching something emerge from a thick fog, only this fog was alive, and it was pulling these things into existence. What I saw next made my blood run cold. The figures were human, or at least they had been at one point, but now they were something else entirely. Their bodies were grotesquely deformed, twisted in ways that defied nature. Limbs bent at impossible angles, faces contorted in eternal agony, eyes hollow and lifeless. They looked like the very embodiment of suffering, as if the pain of their deaths had been etched into their forms, preserving their torment for eternity. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to move or even breathe. It was like my mind couldn't fully process what I was seeing, like it was trying to reject the reality of it. But there they were, standing among the ruins, as real as the crumbling walls around them. And then, as if sensing my presence, they began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they turned to face me, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. It was as if they were looking right through me, seeing into the very depths of my soul. I wanted to run, to turn and get as far away from them as possible, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was like I was rooted to the spot, trapped by their gaze. And as they moved closer, I could see the details, the way their skin was warped and melted, like wax figures left too close to a fire. The air around them seemed to shimmer with heat, distorting their forms even further, making them look like something out of a nightmare. And the smell. It was a stench of decay, of death, so thick I could taste it in the back of my throat. They didn't make a sound, but the silence was worse than any scream. It was a silence filled with all the pain and horror they had endured, a silence that spoke of endless suffering. And as they drew nearer, I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder with each step they took. It was as if the very life was being sucked out of the world around them, leaving only a void where nothing good could ever exist. And in that moment, I knew these were not just ghosts, not just echoes of the past. They were something much darker, much more dangerous. When I finally managed to tear my gaze away, I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I didn't stop to look back. I just ran, as fast as I could, away from those twisted, deformed figures that seemed to belong to a different realm entirely. But even as I put distance between us, I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever they were, whatever they wanted, they weren't going to let me go that easily. After that encounter, I couldn't just let it go. There was something about those figures that haunted me, something that refused to fade from my mind, no matter how hard I tried to forget. I needed to understand what I had seen, to make sense of the horror that had confronted me. So I did what any rational person would do. I started digging, trying to uncover the truth buried beneath the ruins of Chernobyl. I spent countless hours sifting through old records, forgotten histories, and whispered tales, hoping to find some explanation. It didn't take long before I stumbled upon stories that chilled me to the bone. Accounts of workers, families, and children who had perished in the disaster, their bodies never recovered, their souls never at peace. These weren't just stories of death. They were stories of unimaginable suffering, of people trapped in the firestorm, their bodies and minds torn apart by the radiation. The more I read, the more I realized that these spirits, if that's what they were, had never truly left. They were still here, bound to the place of their torment, unable to move on. But it wasn't just the disaster that had left its mark. There were older, darker stories, too, tales of ancient rituals, of sacrifices made in the name of twisted beliefs. It seemed that Chernobyl had always been a place of pain, a place where the lines between the living and the dead were blurred, where the very ground seemed to soak up the suffering and hold onto it. The more I uncovered, the more it became clear that the disaster had awakened something that had been lying dormant for centuries, something that was now very much awake. As I delved deeper, I began to notice strange patterns, connections between the places where I had seen the figures and the stories of those who had died there. It was as if these spirits were drawn to the locations of their demise, unable to leave the places where their lives had been violently cut short. And the more I learned, the more it seemed like they were aware of me, as if my search for answers was somehow drawing them closer. It was a terrifying thought, but I couldn't stop. I was compelled to keep going, even though every step I took seemed to bring me closer to something I didn't want to find. It wasn't long before I started to feel their presence, even when I wasn't on patrol. I'd be sitting in my small, cramped quarters, going over my notes, when I'd feel that familiar chill, that sense of being watched. I'd look up, expecting to see someone or something standing in the doorway, but there was never anything there. Just the same oppressive silence, the same heavy air that seemed to press down on me from all sides. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were there, just out of sight, waiting for me to make the next move. The nights became the worst. I'd lie awake, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind howling through the broken windows, the creaking of the old building as it settled into itself. But there were other sounds too soft, almost imperceptible noises that made my skin crawl. Whispers, like voices carried on the wind, but too faint to make out. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was pacing just outside my door. And the dreams. The dreams were the worst of all. In them, I was back in the ruins, but this time, I wasn't alone. They were there, always just out of reach, watching, waiting, as if they were trying to tell me something. I knew I was getting too close, that I was digging into things that were better left buried. But I couldn't stop, even as the fear grew stronger, even as the line between the living and the dead began to blur. I was determined to find out the truth, no matter the cost. And deep down, I knew that whatever was happening, whatever these spirits wanted, it wasn't going to end well. Not for them, and certainly not for me. But by then, it was too late to turn back. I was in too deep, and the only way out was through. It didn't take long for things to escalate. What started as fleeting glimpses and unsettling whispers soon turned into something far more terrifying. The figures I had once only seen out of the corner of my eye were now appearing right in front of me, no longer content to hide in the shadows. They were bolder, more aggressive, and it was clear they were no longer satisfied with simply watching. They wanted something from me, and I could feel their presence growing stronger with each passing day. The first time one of them followed me, I nearly lost my mind. I was walking the familiar path through the old amusement park, the Ferris wheel looming like a ghostly sentinel above the ruins. As I passed by, I felt it again, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the one that told me I wasn't alone. But this time, when I turned around, it wasn't just a shadow. The figure was there, standing not 10 feet away, its deformed face twisted in a silent scream. Its eyes, hollow and dark, seemed to bore into me, filled with a hatred so intense it was almost palpable. I tried to move, to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. It was like the air itself had turned solid, trapping me in place as the figure drew closer. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been there. But the fear it left behind was real, a cold, gnawing terror that I couldn't shake. And I knew then that whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop. It was coming for me, and there was no escape. From that moment on, the hauntings became relentless. No matter where I went, no matter how far I tried to distance myself from the places I had seen them, they always found me. It was as if they were tied to me, bound by some unseen force that grew stronger every time I encountered them. I'd hear their footsteps behind me, feel their cold breath on the back of my neck, but every time I turned around, they would disappear, leaving me to question my own sanity. The worst part was the noises. They started as soft, almost inaudible whispers, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. But soon they grew louder, more insistent. I'd hear them at all hours, even in the dead of night, when the world was supposed to be silent. They weren't just random sounds. They were voices, though distorted and garbled, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. And they were angry, filled with a rage that sent shivers down my spine. It was as if they were trying to communicate with me, to tell me something important, something I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Every day became a battle to keep my grip on reality. The figures were everywhere now, lurking in the shadows, always just out of reach, but never far enough away. And the more I tried to ignore them, the closer they got. I could feel their presence like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating and inescapable. It was as if they were closing in, surrounding me, waiting for the right moment to strike. And I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before they did. Sleep became a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see them, those twisted, deformed faces staring back at me, their hollow eyes filled with a fury that was almost tangible. And when I did manage to drift off, the nightmares were worse than the reality. In my dreams, they didn't just watch me. They reached out, their cold, clammy hands clawing at my skin, pulling me into their world, a world of endless darkness and despair. And I'd wake up, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, knowing that it wasn't just a dream, that the nightmare was real, and it was only getting worse. There was no escaping it. No matter where I went, no matter how hard I tried to avoid them, they were always there, waiting for me in the shadows, watching, following, haunting me every step of the way. And the more I resisted, the stronger they became, feeding off my fear, growing more powerful with each passing day. It was as if they were trying to break me, to drive me to the brink of madness, and I was powerless to stop them. I could feel myself slipping, my mind fraying at the edges, and I knew that if something didn't change soon, I'd lose myself completely, lost to the darkness that was closing in around me. There comes a point where the fear becomes too much to bear, where the mind reaches its breaking point, and there's nothing left but to face whatever is haunting you head on. That moment came for me one cold, gray morning as I stood at the edge of the exclusion zone, staring out at the desolate landscape that had become my prison. I knew that I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding from the figures that had been tormenting me. They were never going to stop, not until they got what they wanted. And so, with a heavy heart and a sense of impending doom, I made the decision to confront them. I didn't know what I expected to find as I walked towards the heart of the exclusion zone, towards the crumbling remains of the nuclear reactor that had caused all of this. The air was thick with tension, every step I took echoing in the silence that surrounded me. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. And as I approached the reactor, I could feel the presence of the spirits growing stronger, their anger and despair pressing down on me like a physical weight. The closer I got, the more the world around me seemed to change. The sky darkened, the air grew colder, and the shadows lengthened, creeping closer and closer until it felt like they were wrapping around me, pulling me in. And then I saw them, dozens, maybe hundreds of deformed figures, all standing in a silent, unmoving circle around the reactor. Their hollow eyes were fixed on me, their twisted bodies radiating a sense of deep, unending pain. They were waiting for me, just as I knew they would be. I stepped into the circle, my heart pounding in my chest, and the air grew even colder, the silence even more oppressive. It was as if time itself had stopped, and I was standing on the threshold of something far greater, far more terrible than I could ever have imagined. The figures didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel their gaze on me, feel the weight of their suffering pressing down on my soul. And in that moment, I understood they weren't just spirits of the dead. They were the embodiment of the pain and horror that had been unleashed on this place, and they wanted me to feel it too. I opened my mouth to speak, to plead for mercy, for understanding, but the words died in my throat. There was nothing I could say, nothing I could do to change what was about to happen. The figures began to close in, their twisted forms becoming more defined, more real, as they drew closer. I could see the burns on their skin, the radiation scars that had warped their bodies, the looks of eternal anguish etched into their faces. And as they reached out for me, I felt a cold, searing pain that started at the tips of my fingers and spread through my entire body. It was like nothing I'd ever felt before, a pain so intense it was beyond physical, a pain that cut straight to the core of my being. The figures were touching me now, their hands like ice, their voices like a chorus of the damned, all screaming in unison, filling my mind with their rage, their sorrow, their desire for vengeance. I could feel myself being pulled apart, my very essence being torn to shreds as they consumed me, feeding off my fear, my despair, my soul. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The world around me went dark, the pain receding into a dull, throbbing ache that pulls through my entire body. I was still standing, but I was no longer alone. I could feel them inside me, their presence intertwined with mine, their voices whispering in the back of my mind, urging me to let go, to give in. And as I stood there, surrounded by the ruins of Chernobyl, I realized that I had become one of them, one of the restless, vengeful spirits doomed to wander this forsaken place for all eternity. There was no escape, no way out. I was trapped, just like they were, bound to the site of my torment, my soul forever linked to theirs. And as the darkness closed in around me, I knew that this was my fate, that I would never again find peace, never again be free. I was lost, swallowed by the shadows, and there was nothing left but the cold, unyielding embrace of the spirits who had claimed me as their own.